The number of licensed CPAs is decreasing. Let's decode the decline. This is the Issues Watch podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Issues Watch podcast. I'm Don Meyer, Chief Marketing Officer at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, pinch hitting for your regular host, Jeff Kazerman. Earning the CPA credential has historically been one of the most notable ways to establish a professional identity and exhibit a high level of competence in the accounting profession. Yet recent data suggests that we're witnessing a nationwide decline in not just new CPAs, but also college accounting program enrollments. Here with me to make sense of these sliding statistics and discuss their own research into this issue are two of our colleagues from the Illinois CPA Society. First, their president and CEO, Todd Shapiro. Welcome, Todd.
Good morning.
We also have their Senior Director of the CPA Endowment Fund and Planning and Governance, KARI NATALE. Welcome, KARI.
Hi, Don. Thank you.
Todd, in 2016, you said a stagnating CPA pipeline is a threat. It's an issue that will only get worse and grow more troubling without action. Then you wrote recently, 5 years later, the issue has in fact grown worse and more troubling. So let's go back to 2016. What was happening at that time, back in 2016, that made the leaders of the Illinois Society and staff look into this issue?
We had seen a couple things happen, Don. A couple of trends that were at that time disconcerting to us. If you go back to 2014, 15, and early 2016, we had seen, and this is based upon AICPA information, we had seen a continuing increase in the number of people majoring in accounting at universities, but we had seen a stagnation in the number of people sitting for the CPA exam. That was one factor. So first, when you see obviously an increasing number of accounting majors, a stagnating number of people sitting for the CPA exam, that drew our attention to the issue. In fact, we started looking at the numbers, and less than 50, we're about 50% or less than 50% of accounting graduates were beginning to sit for the CPA exam. So if you take those numbers and project those out, obviously, why in fact aren't people sitting for the exam? That raised that issue. You combine that with the fact that what the stark reality is, we have an aging profession. We have a lot of, you can look at the numbers of members of both our societies, I'm guessing, and the number of members, which is going to be indicative of the profession in general, over the age of 50 is significant. So in fact, we anticipate, and it's been talked about, that we anticipate a significant number of retirements to begin to happen in the next 5 to 10 years or so. So you combine a significant number of retirements, you combine a stagnating number of people sitting for the exam, first-time exam takers, with yet seeing increasing accounting majors, that gave us pause for concern. Why aren't we seeing people sit for the exam? And do we have a long-term issue, which we thought we began to have a long-term issue when you see people when you see combine that with the long-term retirements. That's sort of what drove us to the point of 2016 that this was significant. And I will then go a step further and say, what we did see in 2016 was we saw a significant increase in exam takers, but that really was premised on the fact that the exam went through a major change in 2017, and the jump in 16 was merely the people who wanted to get the exam done before the change. So that gave us no assurance of anything had been resolved. But that sort of, answer your question, that's sort of what happened in 16 that caused us to initially raise the alarm bell.
Now, I know in New Jersey, we've been interested in this issue for quite some time, because even with millennials becoming the biggest part of the workforce, and we've been talking about baby boomer retirements for at least, 10 years, probably more than that, baby boomers still make up more than 40% of our membership. They're still the biggest portion of our membership. This is definitely an issue that has been on our radar for a long time, but it was nice in the two studies that you did to see it in black and white, as opposed to just sort of talking about it conceptually. So KARI, why does the Illinois Society believe the situation has grown worse?
So the data Todd was referring to was 2016 AICPA trends report, and then the 2018 data was even worse. And so the Illinois CPA Society had a strategic planning retreat around the same time that data was released. We saw a 10 or 12 year low in the number of people taking the CPA exam for the first time. And so the Illinois CPA Society and our board, in addition to what Todd said about the retiring members and the less people becoming CPAs, also putting into consideration technology, allowing people to do more with fewer people, and businesses happy hiring accounting majors, not requiring CPA. There were just a lot of things going on. The society decided to really take some time and do some research to learn what this audience, the reasons for this audience not becoming CPAs, so that we can see if we can find some answers to the decline.
And if I can just add to that, Don,
Sure.
real quick, and KARI mentioned the 2018 report. So just to be very clear, we saw a stagnating number of new exam candidates, maybe a slight decline in 13, 14, and 15. And then 16, we saw this big jump. Well, the world didn't get better. As I said to you, that was just people jumping to take the exam beforehand. We saw the same exact thing happen, by the way, in 2010 when they made an exam change. We expected, and we fully expected, a trough the year afterwards. People jumped in 10, it fell off in 11. People took it in 16, it fell off in 17. None of that was unexpected. The trends that KARI's talking about were there, and that caused us concern. What then really raised our radar was in 2018, if you look at the number of first-time exam takers, that should have rebounded to normal levels of 14, 15 levels, which already were stagnant. It fell further. And it fell significantly further. And in fact, when the next report comes out and we see 2019, because we've seen some of this information, 19 still at that low level. So when you talk about a 12-year low, what we didn't expect was this drop in 2018 from 17. We expected 17 to be down. 2018 was an alarm clock going off, going, whoa, what happened here in 18 that caused it to drop down? What happened in 19 that keeps it literally at 2006 levels? And that combined with all the trends, that was hard data, not trend data, but that was hard data, first-time exam takers. That was something that really was what spurred us to go, something's going on here, that all of a sudden it took this big a drop.
Let's talk about the report that Illinois did, Decoding the Decline. You had identified that students and young professionals are not pursuing the CPA credential because they feel they can be successful in their anticipated or chosen careers without it. And they ultimately believe any value in the CPA credential, holds is outweighed by its lack of relevance to their personal endeavors and the time commitment necessary to obtain it. That's such horrible news, I had trouble getting it out. You also learned a few more troubling facts. They don't see the CPA credentials having value or relevance to their careers. They don't see the return on investment. They don't see their employers or prospective employers supporting or requiring it. And they see other credentials or specialties as being more valuable to their careers. I'm not sure I could have read 5 or 6 worse sentences for the CPA license. So either Todd or KARI, did your research indicate why students and young professionals feel this way? Because that's pretty damning information about the license. And I should point out, this was not some tiny little study where you interviewed 100 people. If I recall, there were over 3,000 individuals that responded to the survey. Is that accurate?
We had about 2,500 completed surveys, over about 3,000 who started. I will say, to clarify, the points that you were referencing were those who said they are not interested in pursuing the credential front. And so we did find throughout that the perceptions and things of that nature, all of the things swayed based on, if somebody was interested in the credential or not. There was a true correlation of those who wanted to become CPAs and their feelings, but we thought it was really important to dig into those results of those who were not interested in pursuing the credential. And so those are the findings that you were just talking about. And I'll start here and then Todd can add to it. Why did they feel that way? There was quite a bit of open-ended responses that we did analyze. And a lot of the individuals in this group that were not interested in pursuing the credentials seem to have a clear lack of understanding about what CPAs do. We did have some questions about what they, words that they associated with the CPA credential, and this audience in particular highly associated the credential with only accounting, auditing, and tax prep. And so that narrow perception of this audience would make it seem unnecessary if you're, if you're not interested in spending most of your career in public accounting or one of those areas, it wouldn't be worth your, relevant to your career or, return on your investment. And so I think a lot of it had to do with what they thought CPAs did. Todd, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think you raise a great point. And I think the challenge we have, Don, is as technology begins to further automate the areas of what Kari just said. If you think about auditing, accounting, and tax prep, as auditing begins to affect those careers even more, and students are looking at potentially going into the world of corporate world versus going to public accounting, is this really worth the perception of? I'll take a step back, because perceptions are, we can say perceptions don't matter. Perceptions are reality. And the question is this something, if you think about what this is representing, and then you combine that with relatively flat salaries over the last few years, I will tell you, this isn't the first time we've seen a drop in accounting. And one thing people aren't aware of that much, and we actually went separate from doing the study of these students. There's the urban legend that this happened before. Well, we actually went back and looked at some of the trends reports from the 1990s, because if you've been around long enough, and that's sadly I've been around a long time. Back in the 90s, people were saying, oh, we're seeing decline in accounting majors. We're seeing accounting departments have to shut down. We're seeing declining, people not becoming CPAs. And I started with the society in 1998. Well, that was the words that were out there back then. And so it was like, well, wait a minute, hasn't this happened before? And what caused the problem back then? Well, we actually went and looked at the data. And interestingly, if you look at 1992, about 92 to about 2000, there was, guess what? A steady decline of first-time exam takers of the CPA exam. Why was that? Now, I don't have hard data, so I'm not going to make a supposition. If you think about the 90s, it was a time of growing business. Oh, by the way, that's what's happening now. It was a time of growing opportunities in other areas. Oh, that was what was happening back then. And people moved away from the CPA profession. They did. We can say whatever we want, but the reality is they did. And we know that by looking at first-time exam takers. That's a fact, okay? What happened to change that trend? What turned around the 1990s trend? Well, if you think about it, there was a slight thing called Enron that occurred in 2002. Melted down the economy, created that other thing that Congress called, Sarbanes-Oxley, which drove salaries up because we needed a significant number of CPAs to do all the testing that had to get done. That caused this trend. So if you look, the 90s, we saw it before. And it was really driven by perceptions of the profession, which is what Kari just talked about. Perceptions of the profession. And it was turned around by legislative action to a large degree. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just talking specifically what happened in our history. You think about what's going on today, we have technology exploding. We have other opportunities which are presenting itself to students both in the corporate sector as well as other majors. And we see people not sit for the exam because they don't see the return on the investment. I can go into the world of corporate, don't need to get it, can get a great job, get paid more potentially in the corporate side than the public side. It may, or whether or not I find it more exciting, whatever the case may be, I'm not going to get the CPA exam. So I think the perceptions that Kari talked about of the work to be done. If you combine that with somewhat flat salaries, here's your outcome.
I think part of that other 90s narrative, because I heard this when I've been with the NJCPA for about 16 years. One of the first things I heard was about declining enrollments in the 90s. And one of the reasons I heard for that was because of the .com boom, because of the stock market boom, that a number of people who normally would have gone into accounting instead went and chased, pets.com and all of those companies that came out and went public very quickly and then faded just as quickly. And then it was essentially the Enron WorldCom crisis that kind of saved accounting, and of course Sarbanes-Oxley, also known as the Accountant Full Employment Act. But I guess we're kind of, and we're in a similar situation as you pointed out, Todd, now. But I mean, assuming we're not going to have legislative action from Congress to kind of save the day, what is it about this situation that might be a little bit different and perhaps a little bit more concerning? Is that perception that graduates and young professionals have about the CPA license, is that something they feel about all credentials, where they just feel like, well, I can make the same amount of money or advance the same way without the credential as I can with it? So, I mean, is that really the problem here, is like just sort of a war against expertise and licensing and so forth, and just feeling like, well, it's not worth the time and effort?
One thing that was, interesting in our data, many of our respondents said they weren't interested in pursuing any credential at all. So it was not, I want to choose this credential because it's more impactful. It was, we had a lot of kind of comments and a good, part of the research on, credentials in general, and comments stating that this generation, the respondents under 35 who took this survey said, they saw credentials just as a memorization test, not a true test of their knowledge. They saw, in their entry-level jobs, people doing just fine without it, and thought that their work experience would be more valuable. And so it's just interesting comment you made about, any credential in general. It was kind of this perception that credentials aren't really worth it, to me, generally. So they did have respect for the CPA credential, and it wasn't that they didn't think highly of the credential, whether they were interested or not, but they didn't think it was valuable enough for them to spend the time commitment to take it.
And it's interesting, the kind of differentiation between the research the AICPA does when they ask business decision makers about the value of the license and the respect they have for the license. And since I've been with the organization, it's always rated very highly. That business decision makers, investors always see the CPA license as the top of the line. But then when you go down to the folks who actually have to sit for the exam, there seems to be a bit of a drop off in that regard. I mean, so does the CPA license have a branding problem? One of you mentioned earlier that the perception is that if you have a CPA license, you do tax and audit. So is it a part of it a branding problem? I say this as chief marketing officer for the organization. So that's kind of where my head went for a little bit.
So let me take a stab at that one. I want to back up for a quick second. One of the things that, when you talk about the credentialing, I'm sure, and I guarantee, because I hear this in the state of Illinois all the time, when people are going to say, well, it's a credentialing problem, and part of the problem with the credentialing, by the way, so I want to deal with this sensitive subject that that they say, well, if we didn't have to get the extra 30 hours, if we only had 120 hours, by the way, that would solve our problem, because people don't want to get the extra 30 hours. And it's, that the extra work I have to put in to get that extra 30 hours your cost. So be very clear here that we actually asked that question specifically. And amongst those that are not pursuing or not going to pursue or unsure, it didn't even make the top 4 reasons as to, the cost of the additional 30 hours. So we could say, well, is it a pushback to install credentials? Some people would say, well, yeah, it is, because they got to spend extra money to get the extra 30 hours. It may be a pushback on credentials, but it's not the cost of getting that credential. To answer your question, the branding problem, and I'll give it to you a different way. Interestingly, and again, you go back a little bit to the 90s, and I'm going to refer to that because, I think if you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat it. That I believe that heartily, right? There was a study that was done, I think it was published in Bloomberg, that of the top 1,000 largest companies, only 36% of CFOs are CPAs. So do we have a branding problem? We believe we have a branding problem in the state of Illinois. And that kind of, I think I look at that statistic as a leading indicator. Oh, by the way, let's go back to the 90s again and say, what was happening in the 90s? Well, we were seeing some of that same trend. The reason given for this 36% is people don't see CPAs as being strategic. And what they need in their CFO is they need a strategic partner. More and more and more as business is growing, we've moved away from the Sarbanes. We haven't moved away. Sarbanes-Oxley is still there, but as we've gotten that under control and we moved away from the early 2000s, where we saw a shift back to CPAs becoming the CFOs because of all the control issues, we're now seeing this seconding, this resurgence to that trend before that was going on before Sarbanes-Oxley, of people saying, I need my CPA in my company to be a strategic partner. I need my CFO in my company to be. And do I see CPAs that way? Well, and this isn't this is the study that was published in Bloomberg. It says, yes, no, I don't see them as being strategic. So we believe absolutely we have a branding issue. If you look at the results of the study, they saw it as accounting, auditing, and tax prep.
Right.
So,
and what they didn't see it as were strategic, tech savvy, data analytics. We had other words in the association that didn't even come close to the top. Just to add on to that too, we also tested characteristics, and trusted still came among the top of all categories, except the highest next associated word was overworked. And whether that's perception or reality, that's what people see the CPA license as. That's one of the top characteristics they view the license as. And this audience, our respondents, found that a top barrier for them, the top barrier actually for the audience we surveyed, was workload time commitment. And so if you say they see the CPAs as being overworked, they don't have the time to commit, and perhaps that is a generational view of their time, but found that just interesting in terms of the branding when you couple their narrow view of the credential with being overworked and no time. There's your problem.
What is I think the license is more closely identified with public accounting than it is private. You mentioned a couple of things about public accounting and maybe the workload and some of those perceptions. So does public accounting have a branding problem? Is the thought process that, well, I don't want to go in public accounting because I'm just going to get worked to death? And when you go into industry right out of school, you're not surrounded or immersed in that CPA mentality the way you might be in public accounting. So some of this, like a pushback against public accounting, not just the license, but public accounting itself.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I do think there's some. If you listen to the respondents to the questions, and if they saw public accounting as overworked, and if you go back and read the report we issued in 2016, we have to start looking at the world through the person. We can't continue to look at the profession through our perceptions. I'm 64 years old. I talked to a lot of partners who are in their upper 50s and 60s, and they have a perception. I was told by a managing partner once, these young people just don't get it. If they just pay their dues, they're going to get this annuity, and this annuity is going to be, it's annuity for life. Well, if you looked at what drove the behaviors, or what people found important in the survey we did, money wasn't at the top of the list. And part of that gets into, very simply, the life I grew up in the 1960s and 70s isn't the same as what kids or young professionals, they didn't grow up in the same world that I grew up in. Back in this, having one TV in the house, and I'm going to sound like an old person, but that's the truth. Having one TV in your house, that's a world that people today wouldn't understand. Yet we have this perception that we instill on young people. Well, if they just pay their dues, look at what they're going to get. And so is it a branding problem? Is it a perception problem? Public, if you listen to the survey, it said they viewed public accounting as overworked and audit accounting and tax prep. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's not what people want to do necessarily, then in fact, we need to start thinking about how we're positioned in public accounting. Previous research said that if you talk to the number one influencer, I'm going to reemphasize the point, I guess, the number one influencer is, we've looked at this before, and whether somebody becomes a CPA or not, we've always said was your employer. Was your employer, and then it got to your college professor. Well, we actually asked the people in the survey, we said, what are the top influencers in whether you decide to pursue the CPA? An employer, I believe, KARI, came out number 2.
Yeah, so their self was what came up high, number 1, and then down below, almost tied, was employers and educators. And I think that was based on if they were a young professional or student when we dissected that even deeper.
And what's interesting about this, and Don, I think to the point you just made about not accepting, I know some people are going to look at this research and go, oh, I don't, whatever. I know what I know. Somebody would say, well, self is going to be influenced by your employer. So if your employer tells you to do it, that influences self. Well, self has all kinds of other factors. Is it worth it? Do I really care about it? Do I want to put the time and effort in it? Do I care about being a partner? All these other factors come into self, and we've got to start viewing self is not what I tell you is what self-perception is. That self is going to be driven by a lot of things. Now, are firms reacting to this? I'd love to say they are. I think there's some level of it. They're trying to. You look at the pandemic, for instance, and the idea of being able to work remotely. The question is now, will we go too far to the other way, where literally, it's going to be whatever you want, you can have, because I don't want to lose you. I think there's some level of trying to react. You hear, firms going to work, even before the pandemic, some firms were going to work anytime, anywhere. Some firms are going to unlimited PTO as a way to combat this. And I think that was in the larger firms. I think some of the smaller firms, they would say we were doing that anyway. They were more flexible. So I think there's some level to combat it. Yet on the other hand, you look at what's being done, and if I can work anytime, anywhere, but I'm still going to have to work 70 hours a week or 65 or 70 hours a week, but I can do it anytime, anywhere, I'm still working the 65 or 70 hours a week. So I don't know if we've moved the perception, and I'm not sure how we can move the perception to, you're not going to, this is a profession that you can do well, you can make a great living in the public accounting side of it, and in fact, you can have that work-life balance. Have we moved it? Now, I will tell you, take it to the next level. Have we moved the perception to the type of work we're doing? One of the things that we hear out of young professionals is they really care about trying to make the world a better place. I'm not saying that my generation didn't. I guess I'd like to think we did, but I'm not so sure we did. And there's a lot of evidence that we didn't. We're more worried about making more money than making the world a better place. And one of the things that are we helping people to try and think, even if you work in public accounting, am I really there to help small businesses become successful? Are we communicating that message enough versus just adding another tax return, adding another audit, and how do we change the perception? I don't think we're doing a great job on this. We're here to help Main Street businesses become successful. Other people in the world become successful. I think if you talk to partners, they'll tell you that's what they do. But I think when you come into the profession, you think, oh, I'm just going to work on another audit. I'm going to work on another tax return. This is really exciting. Versus, I want to go to work for this accounting firm because I want to help small businesses and the people that own those small businesses become successful. I think we've got a long ways to go to change that, because I'm not sure we're actually doing enough of that.
Todd talked about how top influencer was self, and we dug into that pretty deeply, try to figure out what that even meant and how do you influence somebody who says they're the only one who can influence themselves. And so, but the way I took that is, even if your employer and your educator, your family, your friends, they have some influence based on their decisions. They were telling us that they make decisions based on what they want, not what others tell them to do. And so when you start your career and your boss tells you get the CPA, and if not, you can't be promoted in 3 years, what used to motivate somebody now motivates them to move on to somewhere else. And Don, you asked on another topic about are the employers or public accounting firms responding? And one data point I wanted to mention when you said that was, 27%, only 27% of all of our respondents said they want to spend most of their career in public accounting. So whether the public accounting firms are responding or not yet, they will when, that big of an audience under 35 does not want to stay in public accounting.
Part of the challenge is letting our current CPAs know that there is no magic bullet. If they accept the idea that, this is a challenge that the profession has to face the next 5 to 10 years, that there's no one thing that's going to solve it. There's the individual speaking to the individual, the students or the young professional about what a great profession this is. So it's speaking to them in a way that they're comfortable with, because as the research pointed out, they are really making this choice themselves, and there may be some influences from a boss or from an educator, but it's really, they're making up their own mind. So it's speaking to them. It's continuing to work with firms to educate them and make sure they understand this audience maybe a little bit better. And then it is, to some extent, expanding the tent, whether it's through CPA evolution or something that we didn't have a chance to touch on, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, we all know only about 2% of CPAs in the United States are African-American. And that is a great opportunity to talk to really a new audience about what a great profession this is and how far you can go once you get that CPA license. So I think that's probably part of it is, our job as state society professionals is to let people know that there's no one thing that has to be done, but there's a series of things.
Well, you raise a really good point. And I will tell you, and I'm going to say it again, one of the things that came very clearly in this, because we have a lot of CPAs think they knew why we saw a decline. And again, they keep going back to it's 150 hours. Change 150 hours, you'll make the whole thing go away. And everyone will flock to become CPAs. Well, that's not the silver bullet. It's been in existence since 2001 in the state of Illinois, longer in some states, shorter in other states. We saw increasing numbers. Don't think that that's your silver bullet, because in our survey, didn't make the top 4 reasons as to why people aren't becoming CPAs. So debunking something is important. And then now we have to step back and say, to your point, what's causing it? There's no one thing. It's perceptions, it's branding, it's work-life balance, it's the kind of work you're doing. Is it rewarding enough? Rewarding is in the personal fulfillment way, not rewarding as it puts money in my pocket way. And that's, again, the more we can stop looking at the world through our eyes, that's the boomer's eyes, where putting money in your pocket was the most rewarding thing you could do, the more we can make progress in this.
No, I think that's a great point and a great place to end on. We probably could talk about this topic for another couple hours, but I'm not sure our viewers and listeners will stick around with us. So, this has been an enlightening and sometimes alarming conversation, but mostly enlightening. And it should be a wake-up call to many people listening. So thank you so much, Todd and KARI, for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening and watching. To access the Decoding the Decline report, visit icpas.org/CPA pipeline.